Right, okay, good afternoon. If you want me to dim the light and talk quietly, let me know. So you have a good nap. Let's just see if this actually works. This works. Another second. Yeah. Oh, okay, good, good. You're not supposed to speak, that's the object. Good. Right. That would be the new batteries then. Okay, is this relevant? Is this relevant? My name's on these. I'm not specifically talking patterns and I'm not specifically talking architecture, except that I am. I'm going to take a more product-centric view of this particular topic than I normally do, although I will touch on the technical implications. There is a relevance, actually. Why have one forward when you have two? One of the forwards to this book was written by a chap called Gabriel. He's quite a key individual in the patterns community, helping establish some of the ideas that were used in reviewing patterns throughout the 1990s. And actually, he's one of the people who got me interested in writing in general, kind of reminding me of this. And I don't just deal with code and technical books, I do actually write fiction. Why is that important? Because it explains the fact that I'm going to put in a Neil Gaiman quote later. I like writers, and I like the alternative perspective that you can get from actually looking at what people offer in terms of short fiction. How do they conceive of the world? What are the parallels that we find with software, and what are the differences? But again, that's not the main point. But I'm going to pick on one thing. I did actually manage to get some fiction published in Physics World. We actually have an editor of Physics World lurking out there, hiding. I actually managed to get some fiction in there. Why is this relevant? Because this sets the frame for how we often view our work. This is a book published a few years ago. It Must Be Beautiful, Great Equations of Modern Science. This idea of beauty being at the heart somehow of nature, the heart of things that we deal with. Now, we have a problem here because we work with software and software products. And this doesn't quite seem to fit our world. This is the world of not the world of the thing that is given. This is the world of the thing that is made. And we have this kind of physics envy. And you can this is a term that is often used of subjects that try to elevate themselves, typically by putting the word science in their name, like computer science. People don't talk about physics science or chemistry science, it's just physics. But computer science has had this kind of ego problem for quite a while. And the runoff into software development as a whole, we kind of have these aspirations. We can see it in books like this, Beautiful Code. Lovely book, some really great stuff in it, some really interesting discussions of software architectures, code, products, and approaches. But the curious thing is, I wouldn't have described a single entry in this book as being beautiful. It's all good. It's decent. It's helpful. It might even be sometimes elegant. Most of the time it has a basic aesthetic, or it is convenient or comfortable, but you don't describe things that are convenient and comfortable as beautiful. So we have this kind of aspirational thing. Every now and then something shines through. People often have this retrospective view of things, and they will say, oh, do you remember the programming system X? Do you remember operating system Y? And they will talk about this. I'm going to pick on one. Programming languages are something of interest to me, and these actually give us a slightly educational view. There is a language called Smalltalk 80. The font captures the essence of the time. And the clue is indeed in the name, but it was preceded by a number of other things and kicked off by Smalltalk 72. Again, the clue is years in the name. Now, what is interesting is that anybody, just out of interest, anybody here worked on a Smalltalk system or worked with Smalltalk? Okay. That's actually better than I normally get. That's great. And what people often describe is the elegance, the consistency of the object model and the worldview that it provides. Why did this not catch on? why did this? There's lots of reasons it didn't catch on, but a lot of them are misattributed. Why did this not catch on? When people started talking about objects as a commercial way of constructing software, they were talking both in terms of the user experience and in terms of the actual construction of it. Why did this one not happen? Why did we end up with this observation from Björn Strassstraff, the inventor of C++? There are only two kinds of languages, the ones that people complain about and the ones nobody uses. Why have we ended up with this? Where is it that Smalltalk ended up going wrong? Why is it that C++ is perhaps one of the most important languages ever invented? Next to C. We'll talk about C later. Why is it that this thing that is in some ways surprisingly imperfect, why did this one take over? Why is it that every time you search something on the web, you are using millions of lines of C++? You're not using Smalltalk. You can always spot the Smalltalk systems. Because people will have links to them saying, look, it's in Smalltalk. People don't talk about the C++ systems, because they're everywhere. There's C++ on Mars. There's C++ absolutely everywhere. It's just the way the universe is built. Okay, so let's understand what it is. Let's bring these threads together. I'm not saying crappy is good. That's definitely not the right reading of this. What did Dick Gabriel say? This book, Patterns of Software, was published in the mid-90s. It's partly about patterns, but it's mostly autobiographical. He talks about his time in development tools, creating development tools as products, a little bit of musing on, indeed, what will be a final programming language, so to speak, and other reflections. And in it, he describes, he recaps this idea. 1990, I proposed a theory called Worse is Better. And I remember reading the Journal of Object-Oriented Programming, JOOP, which immediately carbon dates me to sometime being quite old. And I remember his editorial in this one, where he talked about this Worse is Better approach. And I was lucky enough to be on a panel at UPSLA a few years later on exactly this, 2000, Worse is Better, discussing the two sides of this. But what is this thing? What is this approach that he's describing? Well, the first time people hear it, they think, oh, I know this. I've heard this before. It's good enough. It's the good enough software approach. Now, this concept was popularized by Ed Jordan. And that, the problem is, whenever we use good, worse, better, whatever, we do confuse our terms. Ed Jordan was saying something slightly different. This observation, in many senses, good enough software is just a rationalization of what's happening in the software world. The first company hitting the market with a feature-rich product is more likely to win the battle than the careful, quality-seeking company. This is a business myth. It doesn't stop people peddling it around. Can I just check? Who here uses Alta Vista? Okay, there you go. Lycos. Okay, well, they were pretty much first to market.
Lectures 1, 2, 3.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's all these things. There are. So I'm not going to say that this is. I'm not going to say don't do this. You don't want to be first to market, but that assumption of being first to market is insufficient. And we actually find with a lot of the other companies, they're doing that little thing that we call the long game, and they have different ways of doing it. There is no one concept for this. But there is this idea of good enough being a kind of almost an excuse. Well, it kind of doesn't fall over when I run it. Ship it. And Nicholas Bird made this rather good observation. Good enough software is rarely good enough. What Dick Gabriel is not saying is an advocacy of good enough, but it is very easy to cross that line and blur it, in fact. What he's saying is something a little different. 1990, I proposed a theory called Worse is Better of why software would be more likely to succeed if it was developed with minimal invention. That's actually a very different proposition. It also presents us with one thing that is very obvious. For anybody working within software, whether they are working on the branding side, whether they are working on the code, we suck at naming. We are so bad at naming. You do know that Google is a misspelling, for a start. They got that wrong, not on purpose. You do know that almost every methodology or approach that people advocate is in some way misnamed. It is, one of the first things, if you ever deal with test-driven development, one of the first things a good instructor on TDD will tell you is, by the way, it's not really about tests. So why did you put test in the name? You had 3 words and you got one of them wrong. 3 words! How wrong can you be? And we have this all over, whether we talk about our paradigms or our products. The naming here is terrible. Worse is better. It's totally not a description of the approach. I would not conclude develop with minimal invention. That would not be, the obvious approach. And he goes further to help drive the nail into the coffin of his own name on this one. So it's a good idea that the name sucks, okay? Just to be very clear. It is far better to have an underfeatured product that is rock solid. Now, for most people, that's not what they expect when they hear the good enough software approach. So, oh, well, we'll just ship it with a few bugs. No, rock solid. That means like a rock, not like a flaky piece of software. Okay? He's got a very simple definition. And fast. None of this, well, we'll speed it up in the next version, we'll just see what users keep using. No, it's out there, it's fast. It's small. Come back to that one. The one that covers what an expert would consider the complete requirements. Now we start understanding that it is a judgment from a particular perspective of why you say worse is better. So, it characterises the opposite or the alternative philosophy, the right thing philosophy. And he characterises it in terms of 4 aspects, which he also uses to characterise worse is better. First of all, simplicity. The design is simple. Okay, this is a very common aspiration in most walks of design. You can take computers away from it. When people talk about design, the word simple normally turns up somewhere. But this view is a particular judgment. Simplicity of implementation is not relevant. I'm just going to say it's going to look simple from the outside. It doesn't matter what it looks like on the inside. Completeness. I'm going to go for the idea that everything you expect should be there. Okay? In other words, it is comprehensive. It is the definition of completeness here is almost a universal. The idea is whatever you want, it's there. Cover all of the scenarios exhaustively. So this suggests, in order to do this, that we're going to have to do, we're going to have a certain amount of knowledge, a certain amount of planning, and so on. It's already telling us the style of development we're going to undertake. It also tells us a few other things, which I'll come back to. Correctness. Well, okay, this is certainly not saying the good enough approach. This is a fairly hard line on correctness. Yes, it works. That's we'll find that is unchanging. And consistency. The design is thoroughly consistent. A design is allowed to be slightly less simple and less complete in order to avoid inconsistency. Consistency is as important as correctness. So we take this idea of consistency, which is normally an aesthetic, it's a guideline, it helps us navigate anything when we use something. But it's taken it, it's almost made it, it's almost sort of basically said, well, correctness, move over. There's a little bit of space here for consistency. It's that important. But there is an assumption here. And the assumption is, I'll borrow from a quote from Nassim Taleb, whose most recent book is probably better known. That's his first book, Fooled by Randomness. Second book, Black Swan. The Black Swan, which I had to clarify to somebody, was not the film. No, it's not about swans, it's about probability. It's not about ballet dancers, it's about asymmetric probabilities. But most of the stuff is actually here. His more recent book, Anti-Fragile, is perhaps of greater interest to people within software development as a whole. But he makes some reasonable observations here. People overvalue their knowledge and underestimate the probability of their being wrong. Why is this relevant? It's relevant because we have this idea that somebody, whether it is an architect, whether it is a product manager, is going to define what a complete set of requirements is. This is the product. I've been doing this for 10 years. I know the market. Problem is, you cannot know the market. The market is not a thing. It is not a person. It's a made-up fictional concept. Okay? There is no such thing as the market. You cannot touch it. You cannot actually know it. You can become familiar with trends and observations and elements that we generally call the market. There's no way that anybody with a lot of experience, even with a lot of experience, is going to be able to know the market. And in fact, the more they know it, the less they are open to the possibility that it may not be what they believe it is. So there is this kind of built-in boundaries to knowability. And then the market, whatever it might be, is obviously a dynamic system. And what happens when you put a thing out in a dynamic system? Well, it doesn't just sit there being static. The clue is in the word dynamic. It responds to it. It changes it. And therefore will either run away from your product or run towards it and surprise you in some other way. The point is that you cannot know this. If you know this, then you're acquiring godlike status, which is not normal for most product managers, in my experience. Okay, here's the milk going quote. One of my favourite authors put it very, very simply. Knowledge, you cannot have complete knowledge, first of all. This is this whole idea. There are certain things that are genuinely unknowable until we arrive at them. The process of acquiring knowledge, we might use fancy terms like knowledge acquisition, but there's an older one called learning. How do we acquire knowledge? You have to finish things. That's what you learn from. You learn by finishing things. This immediately encourages us to this idea of stages of completion. It informs us as to why we may work in an incremental fashion. Because whatever our vision is, however complete it may appear in our own mind, and particularly our caricature of the market, however complete it may appear in our own mind, you have to kind of finish something and see what it is. And then you will discover that it's not what you thought at all. This is just an everyday experience, and this generalizes way beyond software development and way beyond writing. There's this whole idea. Let me just try something and see whether it is the personal microprocess of something like test-driven development, or whether it is actually engaging with customers and giving them early release access to things, whether it is having frequent updates, whether it is using A/B testing, whether it is any one of these approaches. There is this idea of, I have an idea, okay, how do we know it works? Let's be a little more rigorous about this. Let's actually try and finish stuff. So let's have a look at the alternative approach. What is worse is better in this view? Simplicity. Okay, we're going to use the same categories. The design is simple in implementation. The interface should be simple, but anything adequate will do. Do I have any UX people in here? Any UI designers? Okay. You're not without a job, it's okay. But this tells us a little bit about prioritization. I did do this one over a UX track. I didn't quite get thrown at me, but there was a sort of sharp intake of breath. So I've moved the slides around a bit to just let everybody calm down. Because here's the way it's often viewed from a UX perspective. Now, I'm being a little bit generous. I will say that sometimes from the UX perspective, the interface is at the top and the implementation is all the way, well, somewhere off the screen, actually. Magic happens in between those. But let's put them side by side. But there is a simple separation, simple prioritization. We're kind of saying it's a bit like that. But actually, what we're saying is it's a bit like that. The idea is that we care about everything. We're going to leave interface pretty much as important as it was, because clearly that has value, because the idea is we're not saying it's a good enough interface. It's a case of I don't interact with my mobile, I interact with my mobile phone, not through a command line of quirky commands, although I do actually have a command line for my phone. It impresses my kids, if nothing else. The point is that's not what we consider to be an adequate interface. But what we're saying is that some of our evaluation of the role of sort of higher aesthetics may not actually be justified. It's observation. This was reported in InfoQ. It's based on a study. Where was this reported 2 years back? Aesthetics does not affect perceived usability, but degraded usability negatively affects perceived aesthetics. In other words, usability is more important than beauty. There is this idea that when you use something, the more relevant it is to you, as long as it is reasonably accessible, the more aesthetic you will think of it.
you will think of it as having a reasonable experience. Okay, I'm mixing two terms there, but I'm going to bring them together. There is that idea of a thing will appear more beautiful than it is usable. A thing will appear, the more useful something is, and the more accessible that is, the more you will think highly of it in terms of aesthetics. In other words, we cannot separate the aesthetics from the way in which we work with it. So clearly, offering people appropriate access and adequate access is important. The idea is we're not going to necessarily sort of sweat over that more than is strictly necessary. And when we look at completeness, here the story changes quite again, because we have this idea that design covers only necessary situations. Completeness can be sacrificed in favour of any other quality. Now this one's fairly black and white, or a rather interesting shade of charcoal against yellow. It is the idea that completeness, the whole notion of scope, and this anticipates, by the way, I would say this is 1990. One of the things we're talking about these days, and have finally started thinking about as being normal, so a quarter of a century ago, he was not the first to say it, but he put it into a much more coherent view that was not based on a project management methodology, but was actually based on what are we looking at in terms of products and using them. But this idea of reduce the scope. Reduce the scope. It's this idea of if we have quality issues, then cut something else. So cut something out so we can increase the quality of the other things instead of diluting it to homeopathic proportions, which is what you normally get with maximalist designs. Okay, you end up, it covers everything very poorly. Okay. This approach also interestingly anticipates the problems that we experience with a lot of product development methodologies in the 1990s and early noughties. Namely the feature complete approach. Is anybody familiar with that term, feature complete? Has anybody worked in an environment that had the idea of a product reaching a stage of feature completeness? I encountered a company just in the last year, and I used that term, and we looked at each other, it's just like, oh, okay, it's great when you use certain bomb terms, because it sort of explodes quietly in the room. You can just tell by the way people are looking at each other. It's just like, you do that here, don't you? Yes. So feature complete is the whole idea of we've got the maximal set of requirements, and we are going to build something for everything. We're going to at least have a tick in every single feature. Do not worry about quality. As I said, the quality reaches homeopathic proportions and has as much credibility in that sense. So, Christmas is coming, isn't it? It's September. Christmas is already in the shops, I'm sure. Buy this book. In fact, I without paying anybody, I've actually got somebody out there who was influenced by me rabbiting on about it, and he bought it and started pretty much tweeting every single item he read. It's good, it's good. It makes you look smart as well, okay? Because it's not about software, it's not about product management, it's not this boring stuff. Okay, 101 things I learned in architecture school. It's about architecture, real architecture, building architecture. Lovely book, aesthetically pleasing. About half of it is relevant to pretty much any design-based discipline. And the one that is of specific interest here, the more specific a design idea is, the greater its appeal is likely to be. What is this thing? It's one of these. Oh, it does a bit of this, bit of that, bit of the other. In fact, it does everything. There's a simple idea that sometimes reducing the scope from something that is very large to something that is small actually has a positive marketing value. This is what this does. What else does it do? Nothing. Okay? It's this whole idea of, you know, we're going to create a social networking platform. Oh, okay. Cool. So you can post updates. Yeah, absolutely. And so I can put anything I want, multiple media. No, we're going to limit you to 140 characters. That's stupid. That'll never catch on. Okay? But that is actually kind of its whole point. It's actually spawned genres of fiction and poetry. Okay, and Facebook has not done this. Let's just be quite clear. Okay. Twitter was able to do that. I mean, can you say that about your product? Yes, we have actually created a new genre of artistic expression. So there is this idea that what may appear an obstacle as a constraint may actually be surprisingly not that. It may actually be your USP. So I know this is not one of the Cody tracks, but I thought, you know, I feel uncomfortable to represent any code. But it's quite old code, so does that make it vintage or antique or something appropriate? And it's pre-loved. That's it. It's almost 20 years old, and it's Perl, which is one of my least favourite languages. A friend described it to me once as executable line noise. But what's interesting here, 1995, Cunningham and Cunningham. This is the top and tail 200-line file, written by Ward Cunningham. This is part of the original wiki. No, what am I talking about? If you take the whole of it, that is the original wiki. 200 lines. In fact, that's generous. It was 100 and something or other. But let's call it 200. That was the original wiki. Now, if you went to somebody and said, I've got this idea for an editable web concept, and it's not going to support straight HTML, and it's going to use really simple ideas of linking, and people just put stuff up as they will and as they want. And you create a community, and maybe something will happen, and whatever. People would immediately want to add something to that. Your temptation is, I wish to add images. I want to use spaces in the names of pages. I want to... The original wiki was none of these. It was very, very simple. And certainly in the late 90s was a place that I did actually hang out on. I think I've still got a page there. Did actually contribute to pages and so on. And there was this kind of idea of, it was a kind of almost hippie collectivism gardening thing going on. You grow your own fruit, and it's all lovely, and but people looked at this and they said, this is really interesting. I wonder what we could do with this, because it is so small and so simple that you can create your own, and you can add things to it. You can deal with these ideas. So, of all the people that I know, my kids are most impressed by the fact that I know the guy that invented the wiki, because everybody else is irrelevant. But Ward is just like, yeah, Dad, that's a brand name. Wiki is real. Wiki is a thing. Wikipedia is a thing, and all this kind of stuff. But it started from something very, very simple. You learn by finishing things. He just got to the end of this, did this, and he learned a few things. A little bit about validation, a bit about this, a bit about that. He went on and encouraged other people to create new stuff. And if you actually presented this as a business proposal to anybody, it's unlikely to have got anywhere. Even if you did it, if you said it's going to be free, if you try to get an open source community around it, it probably wouldn't have worked either. So, completeness. We need to redefine our idea of completeness, and that is in fact why the worse is better name comes from. Correctness, the design is correct in all observed last name. No change there. Okay, consistency. Now, there is a difference in the narrative here. The design is consistent as far as it goes. So we like consistency because it does make things a little bit easier. Consistency is less of a problem because you always choose the smallest scope for the first implementation. So in other words, it's seen as desirable, but let's not worry about it because you have to try fairly hard to make something small inconsistent. I'm not saying it's beyond the wit of programmers. I have seen some astonishing results sometimes. But what I'm saying is that if you're going to prioritize qualities, that's not one to worry about initially because you don't have much to be inconsistent with. Now, there is this idea as well, and it's kind of snuck in here. I didn't quote everything that he said about this. He's got many essays on this subject. But that idea of the first implementation, there is an implication there. It's not the only implementation. And that's rather important. So if we look at the implementation characteristics, we start understanding how a few things start playing around. The implementation should be fast. Now, I mentioned fast before. This is, for me, kind of the lost paradigm of usability, the thing that is most overlooked. So I thought I won't quote from a software person, I'll quote from John Mader. Are you familiar with John Mader? He wrote this rather nice book, The Laws of Simplicity, another one for the Christmas list. Aesthetically pleasing, minimal word count, pretty pictures and quite glossy. Obviously overstates this case somewhat. I will say that somewhere in my distant past I do have a degree in physics, and when people use the word law, it does make me twitch slightly. Jolly good like guidelines for simplicity may not be quite as catchy or polarising a title, but that's kind of more what it is. But the laws of simplicity is a very strong statement, but he makes a very, very strong case and a very good point. Savings in time feel like simplicity. When something is fast, it just is. You don't worry about it, you don't have to worry about what you're going to do. As a user, you simply do something, it responds. It doesn't matter doesn't matter what it is. The irony is that he started working for Philips around the time I stopped using Philips products. So I don't know if they got better, but this was one of the reasons I stopped using Philips consumer goods. Because they were, just like every other consumer goods company on the planet, increasing the amount of software that they had. You cannot create a consumer electronics item without software. This is quite simply not possible these days. And so we have to ask ourselves, as the user experience gets slower and slower and slower, why is it getting slower? I tell you, it's because of the software. It's whoever's programming it is making it slower. Yeah, because the hardware is perfectly fine. Yeah, I bump into automatic doors these days because I'm too fast for the doors. Okay, I'm middle-aged. I shouldn't be too fast for a door. Okay, somebody is actively making that code slow. Okay, that's not. I doubt that's very much. The top of the backlog. Yep, make it slower. What I'm saying is a byproduct of how they have approached things. They have not regarded this as a quality. They're still going by the old idea of like, yeah, we optimize at the end. If you're taking an agile approach, when is the end? There is no end. You will never get there. Or rather, when you reach the end, your product is dead. Just as an aside, that is one of the reasons that the Scrum community shifted from talking about burning down your product backlog to burning down your release backlog a few years ago. Because when your product backlog is dead or empty, it is dead. You as a product company are no more, or the product at least is no more. You should always have a full product backlog. It's your release backlog that you burn down. If you run out of ideas, then, well, that's it, game over. So there is this idea that there is no end, that this idea of performance is, first and foremost, you don't have to compensate for poor performance. You don't have to, it's not just fielding complaints, it's just the idea of what do we do with those milliseconds that people are expecting something to happen. Well, let's, I don't know, put an animation up or something like that, or grey the button or something annoying like that. But if it just is, if it's fast, then you simply don't have anything to worry about. People will be impressed. So this is, if we go back to other companies, this was Google's USP. Very simple interface. Anything adequate will do. Yeah, text box with a nice logo above it, and a slightly provocative, feeling lucky button. That's how they landed in 1998. And it was all about the performance of the back end, comprehensiveness there. So, if we look at that, it should be small. What do we mean by small? Small in implementation. Why does this matter? Surely this is something that people in the development space have to worry about, not necessarily people who are going to try and market it and ship it. Well, yes and no. It should be small because there is a very interesting property of small amounts of code. Small amounts of code are comprehensible in a way that large amounts of code are not. When it comes to software development, it is not typing that is the bottleneck. People have been concentrating on how do we get people to produce more lines of code over the years. I remember somebody showing me a code generator a few years ago. So, from this model we can produce 50,000 lines of code. And I looked at the code and I said, yeah, but a good developer could probably do it in about 4,000 or 5,000. If you're impressed by numbers, then perhaps you're looking at the wrong numbers here. It should be small because it is knowable. There's a reason this stuff's called knowledge work. It is knowable, therefore you, as somebody working within that space, you are more likely to know how to work with it and importantly how to change it, because products don't stand still. So therefore what you want is a system in which the implementation allows you to change your mind freely. The bigger it is, the harder that's going to be. People never come, so this is one of the simple definitions. People never you can ask a room full of people, what's your definition of a legacy system? And if you've got n people, you get at least n+1 definitions. But I've never had somebody sort of say, oh yeah, legacy systems, those are those small systems, right? They're those tiny ones with code that we can understand, yes? I've never had anybody say, yeah, we've got this legacy system of like 3,000 lines. No. It's just the point here is that is one thing that you've lost control. It is not cognitively digestible for a team. And there's another property, one that we don't value enough, but it's often overlooked, but I've been pushing on it. It's kind of implied in something on another slide. It's a point that Gabriel makes more explicitly elsewhere. But one of the most important qualities of software is discardability.
the ability to throw something away, to feel free and comfortable about that. Most people feel very, very, very nervous about that as a prospect. But the idea that you can throw something away because it's going to be easier to do the next version, people feel very, very, very uncomfortable with that. It's a very big challenge in this. But the smaller it is, the more likely it is that you can say, yes, we have covered everything. Yes, we are comfortable throwing it. And there is a thing we need to be very, very careful with. In software, we never throw things away. If you don't have backups, possibly. But people use this term, throw away. We don't throw things away. It's bin day tomorrow, where I live. Anything that was in the bins in the house will be gone by the time I get back home. That really is throw away. But in software, we have a very privileged status. We don't throw things away. We just hold on to them. Yeah? We just don't put them in the product. That's different. We just choose not to use that version. That's different. That's not throwing away. We are also masters of time. And that's not just because me and the kids have been watching a lot of Doctor Who recently. We are time lords, although slightly restricted. We can go backwards in time. Going forwards is really hard. And you can only go back to a certain point in your own timeline. But we can try something, and that didn't work. That's okay. Undo. Roll back. Go back to an earlier version. We can do that. You try doing that with physical products. It's really hard. You know that wall we knocked down? Yes. I changed my mind. Can we have that one back up? We're going to knock that wall through. That was actually a conversation my wife and I had in doing up our house once. And there was no Control Z. There was no version control for the house. So we should be more comfortable with the idea that this is actually a valuable property. So there's another thing that fits into this. Should interoperate with the programs and tools that the expected users are already using. Which takes me back to this. Damien Katz wrote this rather nice blog beginning of last year. I always have it in the back of my head that I want to make a slightly better C. You speak to any programmer who works in C, they will have this thought one day or another. How could I take this language that I use, language whatever, I could make a better version of it. As a systems programmer, he's thinking C. But he makes the observation. But getting everything to fit, top to bottom, syntax, semantics, tooling, etc., might not be possible or even worth the effort. As it stands today, C is unreasonably effective, and I don't see that changing anytime soon. So what does that have to do with something I opened with, Smalltalk? I had a PC, usual underpowered PC, a long time ago. We consider it underpowered these days. I told my kids what the spec was, and my older one said, "Dad, what's a kilobyte?" And I explained it to him. And he said, "What's the point of that?" And I had Turbo C and Turbo C++ on it. I also had Digitalk, Smalltalk, Smalltalk 5 on it. And I remember being really excited about this. I had the discs, I put it in, fed the toaster, you installed it, and then I ran it up. And then something happened. The screen went grey. And then a little mouse cursor appeared. And then, sometime later, some windows appeared. And then you move the mouse cursor, and it was this kind of like slightly trippy effect that you moved it, and then a moment later the cursor moved. And that was pretty much the depth of my experience with Smalltalk on the PC. And immediately explains why it did not take off. Turbo C ran. It has this great feature. You can still download it, you can run it on a modern PC. It compiles before you press the button. That's how fast it feels. It is fast. It works with everything that was there. It works with everything. It works with my operating system. You can call DOS an operating system. It worked with everything that was there. It built on it. It used minimal invention. Smalltalk created its own private universe. And it was a lovely universe. It was really nice, but you needed the high-end workstation. Curiously enough, most people did not have that. And so therefore, it immediately separated itself out. Now, it's nice to have a nice little elite thing going, but the problem is that that's not a bubble that's going to grow. Not at the right time. So we now find that we can actually explain a lot of these little things. There's nothing to do with the beauty of it, right? Although,
For a lot of people, an if statement aren't looking like an if statement freaks them out. That's a separate discussion. It's to do simply with fitting in with what else have I got? So it should be bug-free. If that requires implementing fewer features, do it. Again, this is a fairly hard line. And we see some of these ideas coming up again and again, more recently. But what is interesting is these are put here together not as a project management narrative. They're not even put here as about, it's not even team focused, which is often a lot of our focus these days, for very good reasons. But there's a lot of ideas here that we actually see anticipated. And a lot of ideas, you look at things like lean startup and so on, predated here. I actually had somebody say, this sounds a lot like lean startup once. And I said, you want to turn that the other way around. Okay? And keep it simple. Okay? Don't use too many colourful and elaborate abstractions. So, on that note, lovely observation from Jim Waldo, who's an architect at the Sun, when he uses it. The classic essay on worse is better is I'm misunderstood, I'm wrong. Gabriel leaves us with the thought that decide for yourselves, but I hope that I've outlined this idea that a lot of these values there, the term is misleading, but also there's a surprising amount of depth that goes a lot further than just do incremental development. It actually includes decremental development. The idea of, you know what, that's not working out, let's throw it away. Or keep it small, don't increment too much. It doesn't mean you don't want to increment functionality, but keep a hold on the thing that actually is the foundation of the product so that you can change your mind more freely. Do we have any time for questions?
Can we take a couple of questions?
Well, do you have a couple of questions? Because that question might be completely irrelevant.
Test the assumptions. Any
Yes.
questions?
So, there's another derivation of worse is better.
Yes.
In terms of what's sometimes jokingly called the New Jersey School of Unix architecture.
Indeed, I did actually skip a couple of slides, and it's about Unix. So
Because
there you go.
the parallels to your to the specific design, and of course the other part of that is the key essence about implementation is about composability.
Yes.
So how do you make the implementation visible while still being composable?
Right. That would be great if I had a straight answer that was just downloadable this instant, and if I had that answer in a way that I could offer you, do this on a plate, I would not be here. I would be in the Caribbean on my yacht that I would own because I'd made money out of one of the hardest problems. However, I can give you a meta solution, and the point there is it goes all the way back to this. It's a question of knowability. Composable, there are lots of different composability models, and Unix offers one of them, so in a longer version of this talk I tend to talk a little bit more about that, that's why the slides are there. Composability out of parsimonious abstractions, very simple abstractions, and it really does a very good job at exactly what it is. It turns out that that's not the job that most people want from it, but when you do those, it works really well. It means that for each different kind of domain, you're going to end up with a different simple model of composability. The problem is you're not going to know it in advance. You have to assume that you are at best arrogant, or that you are undertaking an experiment. And this again is what I refer to as the kind of lost aspect of things like Scrum. For example, Scrum is originally phrased as an empirical process model. And people rattle that off because it sounds good and it sounds kind of impressive, but without really considering what do we mean by empirical. Empirical means we're going to experiment on something. It means that the whole point of a sprint is not a story point delivery mechanism. It means the purpose of a sprint is to run an experiment that is bounded so you don't go too far wrong. And so in other words, we've got this great idea. Okay, it's great to have a great idea. I wonder if that's going to be helpful to us. Is it the simple model that we want? It's going to allow us to crack open this domain, create a simple product, and the rest of it. Let's try it. Result of the experiment, that didn't work out. Well, good job we didn't spend too long on this. So that's the meta approach. The answer to your question is just assume this. Assume that idea of the truth is probably out there somewhere, but you're not going to get to it in a straight line. You're going to have to wander around. You're going to have these blind alleys, you're going to have to throw things away, but in the software sense of throwing things away, which means I'll just shove it under the bed, but I know where it is.
Okay, the truth's out there somewhere, and he'll be wandering around
I
later,
will be.
so you can have a chat with him.
Thank you very
much, Kevlin. Thank you.